Imagine the horror of a mother's negligence nearly costing her child's life, then having her unleash fury on the very person who saved them. This isn't just a story. It's a chilling exposé on how a tranquil rural paradise became a battleground for child safety, revealing the shocking entitlement that puts innocent lives at risk. Tune in, because this harrowing account of a near-fatal encounter with a 2,000-pound horse will forever change how you view parental responsibility and the true cost of unchecked arrogance. An entitled mother's negligence nearly got her 4-year-old daughter trampled by my 2,000-pound draft horse, then screamed at me for saving the child's life and demanded I get rid of my dangerous animals. Rural peace became a nightmare when entitled parents treated my private property like their personal petting zoo, creating a near-fatal situation that exposed the terrifying reality of parental negligence. Before COVID turned the world upside down, I lived what most people would consider the perfect rural life. My 5-acre property was a slice of paradise where I had built everything I dreamed of: my own home, 2 magnificent horses, and the kind of peaceful existence that city dwellers fantasize about during their worst commutes. The space between neighbors was generous, with everyone owning between 3 to 8 acres, creating the ideal balance of community and privacy that makes rural living so appealing. My nearest neighbors were absolutely perfect, a sweet elderly couple living about an acre away who had become more like family than neighbors. The husband had turned yard work into an art form, spending his retirement maintaining his property with the dedication of someone who genuinely loved the work. His wife was a master baker whose kitchen always smelled like heaven, and together they had created the kind of wholesome lifestyle that seemed pulled from a Norman Rockwell painting. We had developed a beautiful symbiotic relationship that benefited everyone involved. When I needed large trees cut down or heavy chainsaw work done, he would handle the job with professional skill and take the wood for his fireplace, solving his heating needs while handling my property maintenance. In exchange, I would trade recipes with his wife and spend afternoons baking alongside her, learning techniques that had been passed down through generations. But honestly, they seemed to value the company more than any practical benefits. They were the kind of people who made you believe in the goodness of humanity. My setup was complete with 2 horses that couldn't have been more different from each other. My Clydesdale was a gentle giant, the kind of draft horse that embodied everything beautiful about the breed: massive, powerful, but with the temperament of a golden retriever. My Welsh pony was his opposite in every way. Small, cute, but with the kind of unpredictable personality that required an experienced hand to manage safely. Together, they represented both ends of the equine spectrum, and I loved them both dearly. When my mother hit financial difficulties, she moved in with me. And far from being a burden, she was wonderful company. Having her there added another layer of contentment to my already perfect life, and I was happy to help family while enjoying the benefits of shared companionship. At 29, I was the youngest person in our peaceful neighborhood, surrounded by mature adults who appreciated quiet living and respectful boundaries. Then COVID attacked, and everything changed in ways that would transform my peaceful paradise into a battleground over child safety and parental responsibility. My saintly neighbors, being the kind of people who would never turn away family in need, opened their home to their son, his wife, and their 2 young daughters aged 4 and 7. The family felt unsafe in the city, which was completely understandable, but their arrival would introduce chaos into a neighborhood that had never experienced anything more disruptive than the occasional chainsaw or baking timer. Suddenly, our quiet adult community had children running around unsupervised, and I was about to learn that some parents believe their children's entertainment is more important than their children's safety. But the tragedy was about to begin with the most ear-piercing sound I've ever heard, a shriek so intense that it made my 2,000-pound Clydesdale second-guess stepping outside, foreshadowing the nightmare that was about to unfold when 2 unsupervised children discovered my horses and nearly turned my peaceful morning into a fatal accident. What started as typical childhood excitement was about to escalate into a life-threatening situation that would reveal just how dangerously entitled some parents can be when their children's safety conflicts with their convenience. The morning had started like any other routine day as I led my horses out to the front pasture, a simple task I had performed hundreds of times without incident. My Clydesdale, gentle as always, was ready for his morning graze, while my Welsh pony trotted alongside with his usual energetic enthusiasm. But the moment we stepped outside, the air was split by the most high-pitched squealing I had ever encountered, so shrill and intense that even my massive draft horse paused mid-step, his ears flicking nervously as he tried to process this alien sound. The source of the chaos became immediately apparent. The two young girls from next door had discovered my horses and were literally losing their minds with excitement. I understood the appeal to children. My animals probably looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. The little white Welsh pony and the magnificent Clydesdale that resembled the horse from the movie Brave would be irresistible to any child who had never seen horses up close. But understanding their excitement didn't make the situation any less dangerous. Instead of observing from a safe distance like sensible children might, these girls sprinted directly toward the fence, shrieking at the top of their lungs with the kind of uncontrolled enthusiasm that sends animals into panic mode. My pony immediately began running around the pasture in distress, clearly agitated by the sudden noise and movement, while my Clydesdale stood frozen with the same confused expression I probably had on my face. The chaos was escalating by the second, and then the unthinkable happened. The 4-year-old, apparently deciding that the fence was merely a suggestion rather than a safety barrier, dropped to her hands and knees and started crawling underneath the bottom rail directly toward two massive animals she had never met. The sight sent ice through my veins as I realized that this tiny child was about to enter a pasture with a panicked pony and a confused draft horse, either of which could accidentally injure or kill her without even realizing what had happened. "Don't you dare climb under that fence," I shouted, using the firmest voice I could muster without completely terrifying the child. I'll admit my tone was harsh, but I would rather have a crying child than a dead one, and there was no time for gentle persuasion when a 4-year-old was seconds away from putting herself in mortal danger. I quickly walked over to explain the situation, trying to balance firmness with kindness as I told them that these were very large animals who could hurt them easily, even by accident, and that they should never, ever go over or under the fence without permission and supervision. The girls looked like they were about to cry, but they seemed to understand the seriousness of what I was saying and reluctantly headed home. I thought the crisis had been averted and went back to cleaning stalls, but an hour later I heard aggressive banging on my front door. Through the barn's window, I could see my mother talking to a woman I had never met, and from their body language, it was clear this wasn't a friendly social call. When the stranger stormed down to the barn with the unmistakable posture of an entitled parent on the warpath, I knew my peaceful morning was about to become a full-blown confrontation over the audacity of prioritizing child safety over child entertainment. Right at that moment, I found myself face to face with someone who would challenge everything I thought I knew about parental responsibility, as this entitled mother launched into a tirade about how I had dared to make her precious children cry for preventing them from potentially being crushed to death. Her opening assault revealed the twisted logic of someone who believed her children's momentary happiness was more important than their continued existence, setting the stage for a confrontation that would expose just how far some people will go to avoid acknowledging basic physics and common sense. I had never met this woman before, but I recognized the type immediately: the entitled parent who storms in ready for battle without bothering to understand the situation. She began her attack with the classic opener. "How dare you make my kids cry? They just wanted to see the ponies." Her voice carried that particular mix of outrage and victimization that entitled parents perfect, as if I had committed some unforgivable crime by prioritizing her children's safety over their entertainment. When she finally paused for breath, I seized the opportunity to inject some reality into her fantasy world. "Ma'am, your youngest was crawling under the fence toward two large animals that none of you know," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "That Clydesdale is a 2,000-pound draft horse. He can literally crush you, not even feel it, and cause permanent damage or death. The pony looks cute, but he needs an experienced hand because he's very untrustworthy, flighty, and has a tendency to bite. Your children are absolutely not allowed near them without my consent and heavy supervision, and never allowed in the pasture with them. Do you understand?" The math was simple, and I laid it out for her in terms that should have terrified any reasonable parent. We're talking about 50 to 200-pound humans versus 800 to 2,000-pound animals. It's pure physics. When that much mass meets that little mass, the little mass loses every single time. Even the gentlest horse can accidentally step on a foot, knock someone over, or react unpredictably to sudden movements. These aren't malicious attacks. They're inevitable accidents waiting to happen when proper safety protocols aren't followed. But instead of thanking me for potentially saving her children's lives, she doubled down on her entitlement with a response that left me questioning her fitness as a parent. "Well, if they're so dangerous, why do you have them? Are you even allowed to have them? I should call animal control." The logic was breathtaking in its stupidity because large animals require safety precautions. They shouldn't exist at all, and anyone who owns them must be doing something illegal. I patiently explained that these were my personal horses, that I was absolutely allowed to have them on my own property, that her children had trespassed, and that I was trying to keep them safe. I also pointed out what should have been obvious. This wasn't a petting zoo or public facility designed for children's entertainment. These were working animals on private property, and treating them like playground equipment was a recipe for tragedy. She huffed off in indignation, apparently believing that her departure was some kind of victory, while I continued my work and tried to process the incredible selfishness I had just witnessed. But the real test would come later that evening when the children's father returned home from work, because his reaction would determine whether this family could coexist safely with my animals or whether we were headed for an inevitable disaster. When I explained the situation to him, his response was everything his wife's hadn't been: immediate alarm and complete understanding of the danger his children had been in. He grasped the physics immediately, agreeing that the size differential alone made any unsupervised interaction potentially fatal. His horses weren't aggressive, I assured him, but the inherent danger was undeniable when you put small humans in close proximity to large animals. His reasonable reaction gave me hope, but I remained cautiously optimistic because I knew he was often away at work, leaving supervision to the same woman who had just demonstrated that her children's momentary happiness was more important to her than their physical safety. No one expected that my cautious optimism would be shattered by the sound of terrified child screaming echoing across my property. But when I rushed outside to find a 4-year-old trapped in my horse pasture with my 2,000-pound Clydesdale slowly approaching her, I realized that some parents' negligence can literally create life or death situations in seconds. What unfolded next was every parent's worst nightmare, except the parent responsible for preventing it was nowhere to be found while strangers risked their own safety to save her child. I was working from home on a quiet afternoon when the screaming started, and I knew immediately that something was horribly wrong. This wasn't the excited squealing I had heard before. This was pure terror, the sound of a small child in genuine distress. My blood ran cold as I dropped everything and sprinted outside, my mind racing through all the possible disasters that could cause that level of fear in a young child. The scene that greeted me was my absolute worst nightmare made real. The 4-year-old was standing in the middle of my horse pasture, bawling hysterically while my Welsh pony ran frantic laps around the perimeter of the fence, clearly agitated by the chaos. But what made my heart stop was seeing my massive Clydesdale slowly, carefully approaching the terrified little girl with the kind of curious, gentle interest that could accidentally kill her if she moved wrong or he misstepped. Outside the fence, the 7-year-old was crying desperately and calling for her mother, but her cries went unanswered because once again the person responsible for supervising these children was completely absent from the scene. 2 small children were dealing with a potentially fatal emergency entirely on their own, while the adult who should have been watching them was nowhere to be found. My initial terror gave way to cautious relief as I assessed my Clydesdale's body language. True to his gentle nature, he was approaching the child in the most non-threatening way possible, moving slowly and carefully as if he understood that she was small and fragile. His posture was curious but calm, like a golden retriever investigating something interesting, and his presence was actually keeping the panicked pony from rushing toward the child in his agitated state. Still, the situation was incredibly dangerous. He was maybe 3 steps away from her, and while his intentions were benign, one wrong move, a startled reaction, an accidental step could seriously injure or kill a 4-year-old. I couldn't take any chances with a child's life, no matter how gentle my horse typically was. "Halt!" I commanded in the firm voice my Clydesdale knew meant business, and like the well-trained horse he was, he immediately stopped and stood perfectly still. The relief I felt watching him obey was overwhelming. This was why proper training and clear commands were so crucial in emergency situations like this. I carefully made my way into the pasture, speaking in soothing tones to both the child and my horses as I approached. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" I asked the little girl, knowing that physical injury assessment was the most important first step. Through her tears, she managed to shake her head no, but she was clearly traumatized and terrified by finding herself surrounded by animals much larger than herself. I gently picked her up and began walking toward the fence, keeping my Clydesdale at heel position beside me as a precaution against any sudden movements from the still agitated pony. The little girl clung to me like a lifeline, her small body shaking with fear and adrenaline from an experience that could have easily turned fatal if the wrong variables had aligned. But the mother who should have prevented this entire nightmare was still nowhere in sight. leaving me to wonder what kind of parent allows their small children to wander unsupervised around large animals after being explicitly warned about the dangers. But the tragedy was about to escalate into the most infuriating display of parental denial I've ever witnessed when I carried the rescued child to my neighbor's house. The mother, who had been completely absent during her daughter's near-death experience, immediately began screaming at me for somehow causing the emergency she had created through her own negligence. What followed was 30 minutes of chaos that would reveal just how far some people will go to avoid taking responsibility for nearly getting their own child killed. With both girls safely outside the pasture, I took them directly to my elderly neighbor's house since their mother was still mysteriously missing from what should have been a supervised play situation. The 7-year-old was still crying and shaken, while her little sister clung to me with the desperation of someone who had just experienced genuine terror. I knocked on the door, expecting to find a grateful parent relieved that her children were safe. Instead, the entitled mother opened the door and immediately launched into a screaming tirade directed at me, firing off accusations and questions before I could even explain what had happened. The fact that I was standing there holding her traumatized 4-year-old, who was clearly upset and had obviously been through something frightening, didn't seem to register as evidence that maybe she should listen first and attack later. "What did you do to my children? Why are they crying? Did you yell at them again?" she shrieked, as if the logical explanation for two distressed children couldn't possibly be that they had just experienced a terrifying situation while she was nowhere to be found. Her immediate assumption was that I had somehow victimized her daughters rather than potentially saved one of their lives. Before I could get a word in, my elderly neighbors intervened, clearly sensing the explosive tension building in their doorway. Once I was able to explain exactly what had happened, that the 4-year-old had somehow gotten into the horse pasture and been trapped with a 2.0 draft horse. While the mother was completely absent, my neighbors absolutely erupted with fury. But their anger wasn't directed at me. They unleashed every ounce of grandparently outrage they possessed on the negligent mother, screaming at her for being so irresponsible and reckless with her children's safety. "How could you let this happen?" they demanded. "These children could have been seriously hurt or killed. Where were you when your 4-year-old was wandering around unsupervised near dangerous animals?" The entitled mother, faced with this unified front of condemnation, did exactly what I expected. She tried to throw all the blame on me. According to her twisted logic, this was somehow my fault for having horses on my own property, or for not watching her children better than she did, or for any number of ridiculous reasons that avoided the central truth. She had failed in the most basic parental responsibility of knowing where her small children were and what they were doing. But my neighbors weren't having any of her deflection tactics. They had raised children and grandchildren. They understood the physics of child supervision, and they could see through her desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Their defense of me was fierce and uncompromising, pointing out that I had not only warned her about the dangers but had just risked my own safety to rescue her daughter from a situation that never should have occurred. The confrontation continued for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes, with the mother alternating between screaming accusations at me and trying to justify her absence during the emergency. My neighbors apologized profusely to me for their family members' behavior and attitude, clearly mortified that someone staying in their home had put children at risk through such blatant negligence. When the father finally returned from work and learned what had happened, his reaction was immediate and appropriate: genuine horror at how close his daughter had come to serious injury, sincere apologies for his family's behavior, and complete understanding of why proper supervision was non-negotiable around large animals. The aftermath would determine whether this family could learn from nearly losing a child, or whether their entitlement would continue putting innocent lives at risk. Right at that moment, when the father's genuine remorse met my desire to turn this near tragedy into a learning experience, I realized that some people can actually grow from their mistakes while others remain dangerously entitled no matter what consequences they face. What started as an olive branch to help traumatized children overcome their fear of horses became a perfect example of how proper supervision and respect for boundaries can transform dangerous situations into positive experiences for everyone involved. The next day, I decided to extend an olive branch to the children who had been genuinely traumatized by their terrifying experience in the pasture. I remembered being an overexcited horse-loving kid myself, though I had been blessed with a horse-knowledgeable mother who understood proper safety protocols. I didn't want this incident to completely destroy these girls' natural love for horses, but I wanted to channel that enthusiasm in a safe, controlled direction. I invited them over with their father's supervision to properly meet my Clydesdale in a completely safe environment. We set up the introduction in the barn with my gentle giant secure in his stall, the inside hatch open so the girls could see and interact with him without any risk of being accidentally stepped on or knocked over. The controlled environment allowed them to experience the wonder of meeting such a magnificent animal without the terror of being vulnerable in an open pasture. The result was magical in the way that proper horse interaction should be. The girls were enchanted by my Clydesdale's gentle nature, carefully petting his nose and marveling at his size while remaining safely outside his stall. My horse, being the attention-loving sweetheart he was, absolutely basked in their admiration and gentle touches. Everyone was happy, everyone was safe, and the children got to experience the joy of connecting with horses without risking life and limb. Of course, the entitled mother interpreted my olive branch gesture as an invitation for me to become their free riding instructor, babysitter, and personal petting zoo operator. She immediately began making demands about riding lessons, regular unsupervised visits, and treating my animals like they were community property put there for her children's entertainment. Fortunately, her husband shut down these ridiculous expectations immediately, and presumably my elderly neighbors reinforced the message that my kindness wasn't an invitation for exploitation. Since that incident, I've taken practical steps to prevent future emergencies while maintaining the possibility of safe, supervised interactions. I installed a second electric wire along the bottom of my fence, complementing the existing top wire to create a more comprehensive barrier that even small children would think twice about crossing. The system works exactly as intended. When the 7-year-old tested it, she got zapped pretty effectively and learned a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property boundaries. Her father's response to her fence testing adventure was appropriately stern, reinforcing the message that boundaries exist for safety reasons and ignoring them has consequences. This is how proper parenting works. Children make mistakes, face appropriate consequences, and learn from the experience without putting themselves or others in danger. The situation has remained peaceful since then, with occasional supervised interactions when I'm doing evening feeding and the children want to admire the horses from a safe distance. The key difference is that proper adult supervision is now non-negotiable, and everyone understands that my animals are not toys or entertainment devices but living creatures that require respect and appropriate safety measures. The universal lesson from this entire experience couldn't be clearer. Never approach animals you don't know without permission and proper supervision. This applies whether you're dealing with horses, dogs, or any other animal capable of accidentally or intentionally causing harm. Respect for boundaries, understanding of basic safety principles, and recognition that other people's property isn't your personal playground are fundamental life skills that some adults apparently never learned but desperately need to teach their children. Sometimes, protecting children means standing firm against the parents who endanger them. I learned that entitled people will blame everyone except themselves when their negligence nearly kills their own kids, but proper boundaries and consequences can teach even the most stubborn families to respect safety. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button to help others find it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And subscribe to join our community of resilient souls who've learned that sometimes being underestimated is your greatest superpower. Together, we're writing new endings to old stories, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.